Hi viewers, this is Salahuddin with lecture number 26. In the previous lecture, we talked about those 13 colonies of America by English. In today's lecture, we will talk about the relation between those 13 colonies and the colonizers, means the British. So how their relation was, what kind of relation they had, what was their political relation, what was their commercial relation, and what were those limitations imposed on the colonies, on those 13 colonies of America. So let's come to the topic. If you want to have to have a picture of it, or to write down some important points, I am getting aside so you can take a picture or pause for a moment to write down those important points. Introduction, political relations, commercial relation, limitation of the colonies, and so those limitations. The first one is the Navigation Act, Enumerated Lists Act, and Import-Export through England, Colonial Manufacturers Act, and then lastly the conclusion. So coming to the point, the topic, Old Colonial System or relation of Britain with 13 colonies of America. So a relation of England with 13 colonies of America, it means maintaining or extending control over other countries, establishing settlement or exploitation of their natural resources. Earlier in the old colonial system, later on it was completely changed into new colonial system, which we will talk about in the coming days. But the old colonial system was based on exploitation of the native people, exploitation of those who were colonized, extracting raw materials from those colonies and bringing it to the mother country or to the country which had colonized those colonies of other countries, colonies of others. So the old colonial system was purely based on exploitation of the colonizer, extracting raw materials from those colonies. These were the two basic and primary principles which were followed in the old colonial system. Earlier, in the old colonial system, it was always meant to enrich the mother country and to exploit the colonies. So the relationship between the colonies and Britain had the following features. So what were their political relation? All 13 colonies were different from one another in their political aspect. No colony was allowed to have relation with another without permission of political setup and no formation of England. Each colony had a governor appointed by Britain. He would always work for England, and defense of these colonies was the responsibility of the British government. So the political relation was based on these principles, like no colony was allowed to have relationship with another colony of the same nature. So those 13 colonies could not trade with each other. They could not even interact with each other without the permission of England. And then those 13 colonies, they were completely different in their political setup from each other. Some colonies had a democracy which were more developed than the British in these aspects. They would elect, or they would democratically elect their leaders, their leader. And the second aspect in political relation was each colony had a governor, and it was the very policy of the Great Britain that they would send a person as a governor, who would decide on behalf of the English, or who would decide on the behalf of England, and he would always work for the purpose of England. The third important point was the defense of those colonies was the responsibility of the English or the England. So the political relation was based on these three principal aspects. Like the first one is no colony could have relation with each other, and each colony had a governor appointed by the British who would work on the behalf of the England. And the third aspect politically was the defense of those colonies was in the hands of the Great Britain or the English. This was the political relation. The second important relation is commercial relation. The commercial relation was purely based on enriching the mother country while exploiting the periphery or the colonies they had occupied. The commercial relation, as we talked about in the start of this lecture, that they had only one and sole purpose to exploit the colonies for enriching the mother country or the English or the England. So the commercial relation was more in a kind of based on self-interest. It was only based on exploiting those people, exploiting the natural resources of those colonies, while developing or flourishing their own trade and their own infrastructure and their own trade, having imports and exports. The commercial relation, in a nutshell, we can say, was based on exploitation of the colonies. The third aspect in the colonial system is limitation of the colonies. So the English had imposed certain limitations on those colonies. We will talk about those limitations, which was had a one only and sole purpose was to exploit those colonies. They could not go ahead of England in any aspect, which could be commercial, political, social, and many other aspects. So for this reason, to keep them backward, to keep them poor, and to keep them subjugated, they had imposed certain limitation which could only favor the English or the English or England. So what were those limitations? Coming to the first limitation was the Navigation Act. In this act was earlier imposed in 1641, and then again in 1651 and 1660. In the start, we talked about in the earlier series of lecture that those limitations are the Navigation Acts. Those were imposed from time to time, and sometime when it comes to the reforms in the parliament, some sects or some faction in the parliament had bitterly opposed those Navigation Acts, which were later on transformed or which later on changed to different acts. So this is why these different acts were imposed from time to time, while keeping or bearing in mind the situation or the interest of the England. The Navigation Act, what was the Navigation Act and what was the purpose of the Navigation Acts? In the Navigation Act, in this act, the colonies could only export their commodities to England rather to any other colony of the same. Uh, they could not export anything to the other colony without the permission of England. In this Navigation Act, thus certain impositions were imposed or limitations were imposed on the colonies in order to restrict their trade or their import-export activities. Uh, they would carry those goods or those import export through the English ships alone. No other ship can take those commodities to any other colonies without using the English ships. So using the English ships only had a kind of what we call it the imposition or limitation imposed on the colonies as a result of the Navigation Act. So the relations between the colonies were restricted, and if they had certain trade or commercial relation, that could be only carried out through the using of the English ships alone. Second was the enumerated lists. Some commodities could only be sent to England, like sugar, tobacco, and wool. In the enumerated list, those were mentioned, those were highlighted to the colonies that these XYZ commodities could only be sent to England rather to any other colony or any other colony of the other great powers like Spain, Holland, France. So in this enumerated list, there was a huge list, a long list was shown that these commodities could only be sent to England, like the sugar, tobacco, wool. These will be only sent to England in the enumerated list. The third is the import-export through England. And the import-export through England means that if there is any import and export taking place between the colonies or among the colonies, it could only be sent through England. First, if one colony had to send certain materials, it could be first sent to England, and then from England it could be sent to another colony. Thus, England had to perform a kind of mediatory rules between those colonies. They could not establish the trade relation openly or explicitly or sovereignly. They could establish their trade relationship with each other. So thus the import-export could only take place through England. A material, if had to be sent to other colony, first it should go to England, and from England it should go to the third colony. The Colonial Manufacturers Acts. The native of the colonies are prohibited to manufacture hats, steel, woolen cloth, paper, etc. in local factories. In this Colonial Manufacturer Prohibition Acts, certain limitations were imposed to manufacture those materials like steel, hat, cloth, paper. These materials could not be manufactured in the colonies, and these could only be manufactured in the English, in England only. So thus they could not manufacture these important commodities or important items of daily life. So thus these limitation kept them backward and poor. The relationship in this regard as a result of old colonial system really instigated or provoked later on those people of 13 American colonies, which we will talk about in the third the coming lecture. American War of Independence. It was primarily these limitations and these relationships between England and the colonies that provoked or that instigated those colonized to seek independence from the England. So thank you so much for watching the video.